So I'm not Jake Woodruff. I'm Nick Duncombe. I'm the head of recruitment for Playground Games at Microsoft Studios. But it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce one of our long-serving environment artists, Jake Woodruff, otherwise known as Playground's Tree Man, who will be giving a great talk this morning on the foliage breakdown of Forza Horizon 4. And on that note, Jake.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. Play a little rigmarole. Right, so yeah, I'm Jake. So I joined Playground back in 2013, right at the beginning of Horizon 2, where I sort of joined as like a level artist, did a bit of everything, worked on white box all the way through to bug fix. And that sort of put me in a good position when we went into 3. They were like, hey, do you want to take charge of trees? And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Ever since that sort of stuck. So 3, I sort of implemented a new tree pipeline, and then we brought that into 4, where I pretty much had a hand in on every foliage asset at some point in the game. So I live, breathe, and eat foliage at work. As a slight caveat to that, I do so much foliage at home. I tend to do quite a lot of hard surface. Variety is the spice of life. You know, if you feel like you're getting burnt out on something, mix it up a little bit. Still trying to do a bit of foliage there on the side as well, but yeah, mainly mix it up. But mainly I wanted to talk about the breakdown of Horizon 4 foliage today. It's quite a big task. When we released Horizon 3, and everyone was like, this game is amazing, like it has everything we want in open world and driving games, and everyone sort of asked us the questions of like, how are you going to improve on this? And that was quite a big question for us in the team, and we sort of had to figure that out. And so sort of the points I'm going to cover today are generally like the sort of challenges we face through sort of bringing sort of the bump from Horizon 3 to Horizon 4. And the biggest ones were general quality improvements from Horizon 3. Just, you know, no matter where we were set or what the gameplay was going to be, we wanted to sort of boost the visuals. New asset and ecotypes. This was quite a big one because it depends on the location. Being set in Britain, there's a ton of foliage. It's quite the opposite from Australia, where they had a fairly sort of, you know, narrow source of types of foliage. Britain is very broad. Design language we want to do better on. This involves like when you're driving a lot in Horizon 3, I don't know if any of you played it, hit a tree, you're normally going to crash and stop quite a lot. So we wanted to work, you know, do better on that. Seasons, obviously one of the massive points of the game, and it literally touched every discipline and every part of the pipeline, especially with foliage. It's one of our big sort of key visuals that change from season to season. And also, I'm touching on performance, because performance is very important and no one ever talks about it, but it's probably, you know, makes up a large percentage of the work that we do, because the game has to look good, but also has to run. So I'll start with visual improvements. So straight off the bat, I wanted, without a doubt, everything is from photogrammetry scans. So any tileable that touches a tree is sourced from photogrammetry. This not only sort of like brings up the visual fidelity, but also means that we're very consistent, and any location that we wanted to recreate, we could just go out and capture the scans, put that in the game, and we'd get a very close sort of feel and visual to that area in the game. And then these tileables we'd use in SpeedTree and things like that, which is very helpful. As a sort of boost to that again, we had sort of select hero assets, which would use a completely unique base from the photogrammetry scans. Now this is quite time consuming and quite heavy on performance, but wherever we could, we would implement this, and that would sort of really bring an area sort of up in quality. Even if you had sort of 1 or 2 of these assets in an area, it could really sort of heighten the quality of the entire thing. Our general sort of high poly workflow remained the same, just sort of, we sort of really focused in on sort of the shape language and things like that. We do our high poly in 3ds Max, and we source the textures of the high poly from photography and scans that we've taken out in the field. Nothing too much different here, but we just sort of refine the workflow. One of the biggest updates we did was implementation of substance. Back in Horizon 3, it was fairly new, like 4 years ago. Now it's just become completely industry standard. So we don't tend to make foliage completely procedurally from scratch. We're very big on scans because we believe this sort of captures the environments as best we can. But we use Substance to generate a lot of additional maps and sort of process all the textures. Roughness maps, AO maps, any subsurface maps that we needed for the materials and engine to use. And if we did need to do some additional color variation or normal tweaks, Substance was the way to go. So we would input all of our bakes into Substance and output our sort of final textures that we'd use in game. Lighting and materials was one of the sort of bigger improvements. This is kind of an all-round thing, and this is sort of devoid of whether we did seasons or not. It's the lighting materials sort of affected everything. And what we actually did, we went to locations and we captured all the reference in a location. This is Broadway, sort of one of our sort of focus locations that we did a lot of tests in. And what we would do is we capture all the reference, and we'd also capture the sky. And then what we could do is we could put that sky, because of our cool sky tech, and literally put that sky in the game, and then we'd have the exact same lighting as we did in our reference, so we could sort of work out what wasn't looking correct or why it wasn't looking correct, and if we needed to sort of adjust anything in the game. This has got quite key in how we sort of updated our foliage shaders and materials. And this led to some pretty sort of good, realistic looking stuff. We also had the additional power of the Scorpio as well, so Xbox One X, which sort of really helped sort of get the nice sort of, we never really had true PBR materials in Horizon 3, so this was sort of our sort of letting loose with that sort of tech. So asset in ECOTYPES, so this is sort of like the different type of assets that we had, we needed to make in Britain. One of those, the biggest sort of looks we wanted to get was roadside foliage and just the density of foliage. One of these big ones was hedgerows. We sort of had to figure out how we would build a really dense like visual by the side of the road and run it along the side of the road while looking good but also being performant, which is the one thing you definitely don't want to ask a rendering engineer to do is if I can just run alpha cards along the side of the road all the time. So yeah, we had to work through this. They also had to sort of work with other assets, so we prototyped a lot with this, and we had to make sure that all of our hedgerows worked with every single other asset, sort of keeping everything in line, so when the placement artists came in, they could sort of confidently put these stretches of foliage and everything would mix them well together. These are all placed with splines. We sort of create presets, and they could just lay a spline, and it would essentially spawn what you can see here down the side of the road. And we had various presets for that. Hedgerows, so we kept all of our trees are made in SpeedTree. I wanted to keep the hedgerows in SpeedTree. And essentially came up with this little method where I blocked out a shape. We just spawned cards on those shapes. And it meant that we could sort of really easily create variants. And we also used sort of collision on the card tech that it had in SpeedTree. So if cards are sort of touching, we kill the cards off. So it means there's not many overlapping cards. This is really good for performance. There wasn't really any wasted alpha there, which is pretty good. Yeah, and general roadside density. So we concentrate basically all of our budget here. Sort of for the look on the road. Now this is quite sort of an optical illusion. How we sort of achieved this was like behind these trees here, it sort of gets a little less dense, but the sort of focus on the road, we put all of our foliage right next to the roadside. And these assets are sort of designed to like deliberately block what's behind them, not only for performance, but sort of get that visual density. I think we achieved that pretty well. Another cool sort of focus was sort of climbing and ivy, wall foliage. We did really sort of badly of this in past projects. We'd sort of make something exactly from the reference and we'd put it all together and it wouldn't really sort of gel. So I went to the concept team, I was like, hey, can you throw me over some shapes? And this is sort of what they come back with. And you could move these around in Photoshop and see how they'd work together before we actually made them, which is a big thing. On any building, sort of make a sort of quite unique little scene anywhere that we needed to. We also had sort of quite unique places where we could place it and make a sort of an area feel different, which is really useful. So yeah, design language was pretty big on this one. We wanted to make sure that not only did we want to recreate the environments as realistically as possible, but you have to be able to drive through them. They have to be really fun, which is really difficult because this sort of we've been bad at this in the past because ultimately we want to replicate reality, and sometimes having good design means you're actually altering your assets to fit the game design, which we've sort of been hesitant to do in the past. This time we wanted to sort of take a big stab at it and sort of do a better job. So this was sort of an early on scenario of like what we did was where we put a load of different, we thought tree thickness, trunk thickness was the key element here, sort of reading what would break and what wouldn't break. So we did a load of tests where we just drive really quickly at different sort of sized trunks and see sort of where that sort of grey area was between what looked breakable and what looked solid. And this was quite an interesting test, and it meant that this was the first example of where we would actually have to adjust some assets from the reference to thicken up the trunks to make them look non-breakable or thin them up to make them look sort of more breakable. And here's sort of a typical sort of forest example here where we wanted the readable language to be sort of you had these large solid objects and then gaps in between where you could confidently sort of drive through. So here you have the sort of the larger solid objects, and it sort of creates these natural paths between them where you have sort of, you'll always have smashable foliage in between those paths. And we were quite happy with the visuals of this as well, even though we had sort of had to make some sacrifices. And again, you have sort of quite clear like solid collision and then pass through it. It's maybe quite subconscious when you're playing the game, and it doesn't, you know, if you're not a particularly good driver, you will crash at some point, but we wanted to give the sort of the choice there. This also feeds into sort of our asset sort of variation and types. Not only was this a design sort of smashable language, this was also a variance for the placement artist to get sort of a lot of variation out of it. This is an example of, we had 4 pine trees in the game, that was it, the entire game, just 4 variants. Of this type, we had generally wouldn't ever go over 4 versions of the same type of asset. It sort of had quite a lot of overhead on production and bug fix. And we generally try and capture every sort of range there of the assets, so the scene comp guys could use them however they wanted. And they could also have options. So if level design needed a race, we could sort of swap out the solid ones for sort of more sort of breakable ones. So Seasons was our massive, massive thing for this game, and it was kind of scary at first because they were like, yeah, we're finally going to do Seasons. And this was talked about since I joined. I think we were talking about Seasons, and we never had sort of the tech to finally do it. But finally it was like, yes, we're going to do it. And I was like, as a one-man army, I was like, okay, so I'm going to have to do everything 4 times. This is great. But as we sort of broke it down and worked through it, you know, we developed systems, and I think sort of it turned out really well. But to go back a bit, first of all, we literally had to capture an entire year of reference, which is not really something many people have had to have done, or I've definitely never done before. This literally meant that reference gathering was a constant process. Like, as soon as the leaves started dropping off, even like people, like our art director would walk to work and he'd just pick me up a branch and just bring it and put it on my desk. And he'd be like, this would be constant. But ultimately, like, it led to you know, some very accurate recreations. You know, we learned how, you know, why do the leaves go brown and things like that. And we could always go back. And this is actually the 3 different seasons here from the exact same location, sort of show like the variety of reference that we had, which is quite interesting. So our main way of seasonal changing the foliage was a texture swap. This is sort of a fairly sort of technically simple operation. It did have a lot of overhead on art because we had to author the textures. So this is an example of a summer texture and a winter texture. This was again done in Max, high poly modeling. We utilize Substance a lot for this, is to help with this, masking out leaves, adding snow, things like that. But this was sort of the bare basics of what we could do to change the visuals per season. This happened not just for snow as well. For trees, we did this same thing on bushes and grass and things like that. Our second sort of lever was mesh swapping. When we first started off, we thought this was going to be the main thing. You know, as the leaves fall off, the branches sort of get lighter and they do a lot of different stuff. So here's an example. example up here is sort of the same tree in 3 different states, and like, as you get leaves, they weight the tree down and all the shapes change. So we thought that would be the main thing. Ultimately, though, this became very sort of production heavy, so we didn't use mesh swap as much. We actually used mesh swap the most for performance reasons, because what we also struggled with is when we removed the leaves, we have a lot of wasted alpha, and then we had massive overdraw problems. So we actually had to reduce the amount of alpha cards on the winter versions. This not only led to a better visual, but also had better performance as well. Trees are cheaper with lots of dense foliage on. So that was sort of how we use mesh swapping the most. So autumn was quite an interesting one. It was probably the more sort of vastly changing one apart from winter. We actually used a global tint system. So we basically had a big texture where each pixel represented about 4 meters. And we could colorize the entire world. And this meant that you could splat down the same asset and it would sort of produce all these different colors. So for instance, I think this group of assets here, they're the same asset, but all that color is injected via the tint map. All the maps would be authored at a sort of a base green color, so, and then we tint overlay on top of that. This also, it was world space and affected any foliage asset that we wanted it to, so it also affected hedgerows, trees, bushes, anything that we wanted, we could enable it on. It was a quite powerful tool, which meant we could actually vary the look in autumn based on the location of where it was. Have the north sort of darker reds, the south sort of lighter greens, stuff like that. We also made a lot of use of substance. So for the winter, we would still do a lot of authoring in 3ds Max, and then we'd bring our textures into Substance. And we could do things like, this is an example of, we had quite a custom powerful snow node, which we could sort of winterize anything we needed. This is quite powerful because it meant that if art direction was like, oh, we need a bit more snow, or we need a bit less snow, we could sort of pull that back and just re-export it. This did lead to some issues of where if you had quite heavy snow on an asset and you moved it to another part of the world, it wouldn't really fit in, but we sort of found a sort of happy middle ground there. So yeah, the power of Substance sort of coming in there again. And so lastly, I wanted to sort of touch on performance. Performance is a massive thing. If it doesn't run, people are going to get really angry, even if it looks like the most amazing game ever. So performance was a big one. We actually had to sort of budget our assets based on where they were and how we use them. I mean, as an example, so these forest assets, so the big pine trees, they're under 1,000 tries because our mission was to get the most density possible out of them. So if you go in there with high budget trees, it's not going to run. As soon as you get out of the forest, we sort of utilize sort of our higher spec assets. It varies based on location. For instance, in our urban environments, we wanted to get the density of the building, so we had to sacrifice the density of the trees, which was sort of a purpose visual. We could use sort of higher mesh density for the individual assets, but we just had less of them. And this sort of really helped sort of to make it, not only do we have to run at constant 30, but we also had to run now at constant 60 on Xbox One X. And sort of foliage was quite a big key in optimizing the game for that. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight the performance thing, because I know when we're doing personal projects and things like that, it's not really a key thing, but it's really good to sort of talk about, especially if you're having some sort of interview as well. It's like super important performance. So I know it's quite high level, but if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Anything specific or broadly environment related, I'm totally up for questions. And if no one puts a hand up, we have free T-shirts for every person who answers a question.
It can be anything studio-based, environment or recruitment.
Or even not environment, I don't know. Hit me.
I was going to say, how difficult was it for your team to be sort of, to target that sort of base Xbox One console, and how sort of tempted were you to sort of like tune it up there for the One X?
So our job is literally to push the Xbox until there's like fire coming out of it. It's like probably one of our like key goals as art team. And we do that, and then we rein ourselves back in. It's very difficult, because it's like, hey, we need to half the poly counts of the trees, and I'm sitting there just like crying. But it's a balancing act, and a lot of it is also with rendering and the other teams that help us out on that. Luckily, we didn't have to make too many sacrifices, because Horizon 3 looked great, and that was the base. And we just had to sort of build on top of that. So yeah, it's very difficult, but we also have a very good team. So.
You want next?
Yeah, over here.
Oh, when you were gathering reference images for the foliage, what would you say is the general amount of images you take for one asset?
Good question. So, I mean, we had like terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of reference overall, times 4 this time. It was crazy. Our servers just, could take it. For an individual asset, with photogrammetry, it was quite a lot. With roughly around, I would say, 300 images an asset. Less is probably more, though. Photogrammetry, sometimes, if you process some photogrammetry with less images, it will give you a better result. So, yeah, around 300. One of you in the middle.
How important would you say it is now to use like traditional texturing skills, like with Photoshop and such things like that, when applying for a job with someone like yourselves?
I would say it's important, because Photoshop is still key, even if you're just using it as a middle thing to move, to like save things off or do stuff with it. And I think that base, like without Substance is built on the back end of Photoshop in terms of layering and things like that, and I think it's still a fundamental skill that I think is important. Yeah, totally. Yeah, the front.
Going from education to industry, what did you find was the biggest, what was most daunting, leaving uni to then trying to find a job?
The most daunting thing, I think it was like, how am I sort of, you expect, how am I going to, everyone wants experience, you have no experience, so it's like trying to like sell that. But I think ultimately, if, we're looking at the content and the quality of the content, so like, if you have really good stuff and it's targeted maybe at a specific genre or like even studio, then they'll recognize that. And I think that sort of gets you over that hurdle of, oh, I don't have any experience. So yeah.
Cool. I'm going to chuck at the back. Had his hand up for most of it.
Due to the low specs of Xbox One and Xbox One X, did you need to make any compromises? And if you did so, what kind of compromises did you make on the graphical and?
So on the base Xbox One, we actually remove, which is surprising. A lot of games do this. We remove normal maps from our foliage. So the base Xbox One has no normal maps. It's purely vertex lit. This gives you a massive boost in performance, and we sort of trick the normals on the base Xbox One with various lighting and sort of spec tweaks. But that was the biggest thing. Not many people notice it. But yeah, it's also running per pixel, per vertex shadows as well. So yeah, lower res shadows and no normal maps on any of the foliage on Xbox One base. It's the biggest one.
Where am I going now, Jake?
Go, wherever you're in the middle, again.
When you left uni, were you expecting to go into like foliage and stuff, or did you just happen to fall into that?
No, literally, I mean, as I do a lot of HUD surface at home. They brought me into a meeting room one day and was like, hey, do you want to just, there's no one in charge of this, do you want to just do foliage? And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And then literally, 4 years later, still doing it. But I think the main reason though is it's something that was crazily difficult and I'd never done before, and I think that's the thing. Is just, do something that kind of makes you a bit uncomfortable, because you'll probably do really well at it. So yeah.
Cool. Where am I looking now?
Come back to the front.
To the frontish, making me run.
What are you capturing your photogrammetry with?
In terms of cameras?
Yeah.
I think we have some old 30Ds at the studio. We also have a few 1Ds that we use. We capture the skies with these I mean, I think they're like £3,000 a piece. It's ridiculous, but they have some very good captures. No, but the 30Ds were my main capture source.
Yeah, are you doing anything special like lighting, or are you using polarized photography? Or anything like that?
So we tried a lot with polarization and also a lot with, trying to do a lot of de-lighting and things like that. Ultimately, there's no good process on that. It is, I find it more productive to just look out the window and go, oh, hey, it's overcast today, I'll go out today. Or, no, I'll leave that to tomorrow because there's, big sunlight. I think that is ultimately still the easiest thing to do. And ultimately, I could probably capture something on my iPhone these days and put it in the game and no one would know. But yeah, I think any sort of standard DSLR is not too fancy of a rig.
One at the back, Jake?
Yeah?
What's your pipeline for photogrammetry? Like, do you use Agisoft?
Yeah, so we started using Agisoft. We started before reality capture was available, and then we switched to reality capture. I'm not sure what the cost is on each of them, but reality capture is way quicker. Agisoft gives you a better result if you want to wait 7 days for a bake, basically. But we ended up using reality capture because it's quicker.